When it comes to storytelling, it should be something you could consider fair. The story can be complex and filled with metaphors to back up the basic plot, but you need to be able to reliably trust in the creator to give you all the information needed to figure out what's happening on your own. Now, there are some exceptions, and these works are generally so exceptional that they only work the way they do because of some arcane plot devices or weird structure. They aren't a square peg trying to fit a round hole, they're, I don't know, a sphere or something. They're working on a different dimension altogether. But here are some rules that I've thought of, and a few forgotten ones that have been around for a while, that help keep things consistent and fair. First, what do I mean by an unfair story? Well, I came up for the idea for this video after reading dozens of comments on my video about The Shining, about various theories of little hidden messages strewn throughout the movie. Kubrick was secretly admitting he faked the moon landing. It's a commentary about America's cessation of the gold standard. It's about Danny getting molested. It's about all kinds of things. The last one's the most believable, but there's one problem that all those theories share, and that's what this video is about. Those hidden messages are strewn throughout the movie like breadcrumbs, from paintings on the wall in the background that you can only see in the recent Blu-ray release, to the room number being a reference to the distance from the Earth to the Moon. It's 238,900 miles, not 237,000. Even particular camera angles are supposedly a connection. There's no plausible way to connect all the dots with one viewing, or even if you ever do. The problem with all those interpretations of The Shining is that they all contradict each other. Stanley Kubrick was obviously trying to secretly tell a story below the surface. Okay, sure, I'll bite. But he can't tell a seemingly infinite amount. If you take one interpretation as truth, others start to fall apart. But maybe this isn't the best example. How about American Psycho? Spoiler alert, most of it was all in his head, but not all of it. He probably never killed anyone. That business card scene probably happened.
Look at that subtle off-white coloring. The tasteful thickness of it. Oh my god. It even has a watermark.
How about the scene at the club? He probably did a bunch of drugs. Did he tell that girl he worked in?
Oh, murders and executions mostly.
Do you like it?
Well, it depends. Why?
Well, most guys I know who work in mergers and acquisitions really don't like it.
But that's not the point, because in the end it doesn't really matter. The point of the movie is I'm a guy who looks like everybody else and I'm out in the world. There's no Schrodinger's plot where one interpretation makes the others not exist. Honestly, even if he did kill a bunch of people, it doesn't really matter because it's about how he could have, how he wanted to. A good story gets its message across without it feeling like a lecture, but also without a feeling of confusion. Now, there are subgenres where putting the pieces together is a sort of puzzle there for the viewer to solve. Mind-screw movies like American Psycho or Pi might not make sense on your first viewing, but they can if you pay attention. This is different than trail of breadcrumb storytelling because all the necessary plot devices are out in the open. Imagine it as a game of chess between you and the creator. In this metaphor, your goal is to try and figure out what's going on in the story. Most games are pretty easy because most creators are playing to lose. They want you to figure out the story. But in some deeper, more complex stories filled with metaphors and symbolism, there might be an obvious surface story with a more complex second story being told in the background. You could get the creator into check pretty easily, and while you might think you've won, they aren't in checkmate. An example would be something like Blade Runner, where 30 years later theories and speculations are still flying around, simultaneously helped and hindered by a long-awaited sequel. There's an obvious narrative, but behind it, there are questions about the nature of humanity and who's a replicant or not.
So what does this cartoon mean?
It shows how the depletion of our natural resources has pitted our small farmers against each other.
Yes, and birds go tweet. What else?
Then there's this third type, the unfair story, where you're not even playing chess, you're playing Battleship, and the creator moves their ships if you're gonna hit them so that it's impossible for you to win. That's what I mean by internal consistency. Even if there is a hidden message from the creator that is meant to be analyzed over decades and pieced together by obsessive fans on the internet, it has to be consistent. It has to be chess, not Battleship, because if you go on thinking you're going to find something, You're going to find it.
Buzz. Larry Miller voiced a character called Buzzwell in the Oscar-nominated film, B-movie. Buzzwell. BuzzFeed. What is the connection? Hold up. Who's someone who needs a feed, and who is not well? That is bloody right. People with obesity. But what has obesity got to do with BuzzFeed being a part of the Illuminati? Well, let's find out. Obesity Donald Trump. Here's what Donald Trump thinks about BuzzFeed.
BuzzFeed, which is a failing pile of garbage.
Pile of garbage, pile of lard, chasm is a deep fissure in the Earth's surface. BuzzFeed belongs on the Earth's surface. The surface is the top of BuzzFeed website. It says tasty, and tasting involves food, feed. Buzz Aldrin likes a feed. Buzz and feed make BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed is one word. There is one I in the Illuminati, so BuzzFeed is Illuminati confirmed.
These are a set of rules made in 1929 by author Ronald Knox, specifically for the mystery genre, though most of the rules can apply to other genres, and people seem to have taken many of them as assumed common sense guidelines, even if they've never heard of him or his rules in particular. The criminal must be mentioned in the early part of the story, but must not be anyone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to know. All supernatural or preternatural agencies are ruled out as a matter of course. Not more than one secret room or passage is allowable. No hitherto undiscovered poisons may be used, nor any appliance which will need a long scientific explanation at the end. No random passerby must figure into the story. No accident must ever help the detective, nor must he ever have an unaccountable intuition which proves to be right. The detective himself must not commit the crime. The detective is bound to declare any clues which he may discover. The sidekick of the detective, the Watson, must not conceal from the reader any thoughts which pass through his mind. His intelligence must be slightly, but very slightly, below that of the average reader. Twin brothers, and doubles generally, must not appear unless we have been duly prepared for them. For a mystery story, these rules make sense for the most part. Though, if your setting is fantasy or sci-fi, you may need to make any magic or technology a bit more mundane. For other genres, let's use Harry Potter as an example, these are also good rules. The criminal, usually Voldemort or one of his minions, is always mentioned near the beginning, and we have at least a general idea of what he is up to, though there is usually an attempt at deception to put the blame on the events of each book or movie on another character. For a story about a magic school, there is surprisingly little magic going on. The reason for the second rule is so that the detective or the criminal cannot receive miraculous insight, much like the sixth rule, or a deus ex machina that solves other problems instantly, as is traditional in Greek tragedy. But because of the prevalence of magic and fantasy elements in Harry Potter, the second rule can be hand-waved a bit, because for them, magic is mundane. It's an equal opportunity skill, nobody has an unfair advantage, though there are times when spells are pulled out of nowhere. The third rule is definitely for mysteries only. Coincidentally, Hogwarts has a ton of secret passages, but most stories have any and don't really need this rule. The fourth is basically the early 20th century version of a wizard did it. Again, coincidence that I used Harry Potter. Not sure if that makes it a good choice or a bad one. Anyway, I think this is also mystery only, or maybe our culture has changed to appreciate Rube Goldberg devices and complicated schemes with forethought more. Number 5. The one that was originally trying not to be racist, but is actually super racist now. In the Harry Potter world, this would be a random muggle didn't do it. All too often, a random Chinese passerby would be the culprit, which would actually make for a really bad story. Probably because it reflected reality a bit too much, and that they actually didn't do it, but the guy in the huge manor needed a scapegoat, and who cares if the Chinaman gets the blame. I don't know if that happened in real life, but it happened in fiction enough for people to hashtag ban it, so it's lazy writing at the very least. 6 is pretty much the same as 2, but he can't trip over something and find a clue. Again, this is more a mystery genre rule. This happens a lot in Harry Potter actually. Harry's biggest talents are flying, friendship, and luck. 7 through 9 are a result of the way mystery stories are formatted. The detective character is the only one who has verifiably objective truth, kind of like a camera, and everyone else is suspect. They're way smarter than everybody else though, so they need Watson to be slightly dumber than the reader and constantly ask what's going on so the detective can explain the plot. It's almost exclusively a mystery trope, but the smart person who knows everything narrator and the clueless reader analog is a good character dynamic to have when you need a plot dump. In Harry Potter, Hermione is always explaining things to Ron and Harry, and Dumbledore to Harry. Generally, everyone explains things to Harry. Number 10 is a good rule in any story. Surprise twins out of nowhere is the epitome of unfair. Duly preparing for them makes it fair. Chekov's gun is the idea, coming from stage plays where space and setup time was essential, that everything in the scene should be there for a reason, using the example of a gun. If it is there in the first act, it should be shot by the end, otherwise it has no purpose being there. Reversing that idea, if something has a relevance to the plot, it should be out in the open and not hidden. Now that's not to say that every little thing needs to be foreshadowed. Plot twists are great. But there's a difference between plot twists and things happening out of nowhere. A good plot twist makes sense in hindsight, or at least it should if the story is fair. But if something just randomly happens, you have a certain immersion-shattering feeling of what just happened, and not in a good way. Going a bit further and using The Shining as an example, you shouldn't have to look at blurry background objects and associate camera angles and music on a second viewing to connect the dots. Everything needs to be in the foreground, both literally and mentally. So, these are just some guidelines to determine what I consider a fair story. There are probably more that I haven't thought of, and most of these can be bent in some way. Fiction is very malleable, especially when it comes to your interpretation of it. That is also why, from a creator's standpoint, if you're going to have a subtle and thoughtful way of telling a story, you have to be very careful in doing so, or people will come up with an infinite number of ways to interpret it. Check out my video on postmodernism for the good and bad sides of story interpretation. And if you like this video, you know what to do. Subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you around.